Inspired by an article she read in a newspaper from New York, Longview attorney Kelly Heitkamp started her own pet memorial tree in front of her office near downtown Longview. The public is welcome to put a picture ornament or anything you would like in remembrance of your pet.
I think people just, they don't have a lot of outlets. You know, people who have suffered the loss of a pet. Sometimes people don't understand the true magnitude and horror of that loss, especially the impact it has this time of year. And this gives people an opportunity to do that.
The tree also has lights around it. Heitkamp says the decorations will be up through January the 6th.